Hey famous warrior, welcome back to our channel. If this is your first time here, my name is Louise Mupeta and you are most welcome. This is our space to get encouragement and inspiration to face the battles of life. Before we get started, I would like to remind you to subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so that you don't miss any videos. If you're watching this on Facebook, like and follow the Famous Warrior page to get all the content that we prepare for you. The other day, I was watching a TV show with Caesar and Frida, and one of the scenes got me thinking. I actually paused the show to ask Caesar and Frida if they had someone or someones in their life that knew them well enough to retell their life story. The good, the bad, and the ugly parts. We then got off talking about why it's so normal to know someone, whether a family member or friend, yet be unable to share their life experience fully. We unpacked the need for authenticity and deeper conversations which are hindered by fear of judgment and gossip. It really got me wondering what the devil is trying to keep from us by causing us to have these fears. I always look at common problems and challenges like early death, fatherlessness, and child loss, and I wonder what the devil is trying to destroy or distort by causing these things. So it got me thinking along those lines. And you have probably heard Brene Brown and other prominent speakers and influencers use the phrase, vulnerability is a superpower. But more than just a nice quote or a cool hashtag, I want to explore why vulnerability is our superpower and what the devil is trying to keep us from enjoying by bombarding us with fear, which then causes us to withhold our true selves from the people that we love. To start with, when I looked up the definition of the word vulnerability, this is what I found. Vulnerability is defined as the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. This definition sounds so negative, and I don't know about you guys, but it makes me even want to clam up. Before I offer a new definition for the word vulnerability that we can all employ, I want to explore some reasons why we avoid this word, this emotion, and this disposition. I believe that the reason we struggle with being vulnerable is that we lost our place back in the Garden of Eden. Yes, stay with me, guys. When God created Adam and Eve back in the beginning, they were naked. They weren't just naked at the moment of creation. They stayed naked. It was their normal. It was their way of life. And I don't know about you, but I believe that being naked is the most vulnerable position that we can be in. Think about it. When a baby is born, they are at their most vulnerable. They're new to using their lungs. They've been stripped from their cocoon. They're cold, they're tiny, and they're naked. Even in marriage, true intimacy is enjoyed clothes off and lights on with nowhere to hide. But when sin entered the world, one of the first things to get twisted and misunderstood was vulnerability. All of a sudden, Adam and Eve became aware of the fact that they were naked. They had been naked the whole time, but all of a sudden, it was a problem. And vulnerable, they could connect with God and with each other. No barriers, no hindrances. But now this was going against their new need to protect and hide themselves. This is exactly what Satan's plan was and still is. The fact that vulnerability is now a dirty word placed them and us in a position where many other things would suffer. With vulnerability out of the way, Satan could introduce and heighten fear, shame, self-consciousness, anxiety, disappointment, grief, distrust, blame, inadequacy, and all the other things that we have been struggling with for generations and generations. And let me just get a bit vulnerable myself here and share a story with you guys. A few months ago, I shared the story of my mom being in a near tragic car accident in my blog. And a dear friend of mine whom I met when I was 8 years old and in the 4th grade texted me to say that she had no idea that this had happened. We got off talking about the events that surrounded the accident and everything that happened at the hospital and all that stuff. And I shared with her that the fact that God used what the enemy meant for evil and turned it around for good was actually for my mom's benefit. One of the good things that came out of that accident is that my mother finally gained the strength to leave my father, my biological father, that is. I say it was a good thing because their relationship was toxic and my mom really needed to get out. But as the conversation with my friend continued, she admitted that she always thought that my biological father had died and didn't remember me ever speaking about him back in primary school. When she said this, a flood of memories came rushing back. You see, growing up, I always kept my cards close to my chest. I was more observant than talkative, and I liked it that way. The funny thing is that between the ages of about 7 to about 13, all my friends had great relationships with their fathers. Until the age of 14, I was yet to encounter a friend who had an absent father or a dysfunctional relationship with their father like I did. So all my friends, literally everyone from school to church, they had their fathers and their fathers were active in their lives. So because of this, I started to make up stories about my father. When I was complimented by my friends about singing or dancing, I remember that I would say that my father was a singer and a dancer out of the country, and that's why he wasn't around. I think after making up every story in the book, or every story that I could come up with at the time as an 8, 9, 10-year-old, it became easier for me to just say that my dad had died. And I completely forgot that this was the narrative that I was living by. Having this conversation with my close friend brought up all these lies that I had told. And it was easier for me back then to lie than to be vulnerable and to admit to my friends, both at church and at school, that the man who was supposed to be my first love, my daddy, my dad, he decided that he didn't want me unless he could get something from me. And as a child, I fought against vulnerability by hiding behind lies and my introverted personality. As I grew into adolescence, this fear of rejection and commitment against being vulnerable showed up as perfection and in my drive to perform. I guess I figured that if people were too busy looking at how great I was or how great I was doing, then they wouldn't be able to see my broken pieces. As an adult, I think that this desire to only show the parts that I felt would be acceptable showed up in me being busy. If I was busy serving, busy working, or busy doing, then maybe I could outrun my truth. When I worked at the church a few years back, my team underwent some mentorship from one of the senior pastors. In one of our sessions, we had to list our strengths and weaknesses and then list those of our teammates. So when it was my turn, we kind of sat in a room and went person by person sharing what we had written. And when it was my turn, my teammates shared the strengths and weaknesses that they had listed down for me. And most of them were very spot on with what I had identified and even listed about myself. But one of the weaknesses that I wrote down that shocked my whole team was that I had low self-esteem. Literally all 3 of my teammates were adamant that this wasn't true. But my pastor, my senior pastor, who had met me when I was 13 years old, she knew that this was true. She shared with the group that the reason they didn't know this about me was because I was good at hiding it. That truth stayed with me, and it still stays with me today. I can literally hear her voice saying that. The reason you don't know this about Louise is because she's so good at hiding it. All 3 of my workmates back then, and even now, all 3 of them still to this day, were and are my close friends. One of them, believe it or not, is the same friend that I'm talking about that I met when I was 8 years old and in the 4th grade. Because of that conversation in that training session, I made a mental note back then that I would be more real with my friends, even about the sides of myself that I was ashamed about. And I would like to think that I have made significant progress in this area. I say all this to bring you guys to my new definition for the word vulnerability that I hope not only can we embrace, but actually begin to even use it in our vocabulary. So here goes. Vulnerability is the courage to share yourself with God and others authentically and sincerely. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that vulnerability is declaring both our weaknesses and fears before God and before others. Why in the world would I want to do that? You might be asking. Well, here are some scriptures that actually give us a foundation of why we should be doing this. James 5:16 says, "Make this your common practice. Confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you can live together whole and healed." Galatians 6:2 in the Message paraphrase says, "Live creatively, friends. If someone falls into sin, forgivingly restore him, saving your critical comments for yourself. You might be needing forgiveness before the day is out. So stoop down and reach out to those who are oppressed. Share their burdens and so complete Christ's law. If you think you are too good for that, you are badly deceived." So back to my theory that if the devil has distorted our view of vulnerability, then there must be something that he is trying to desperately keep us from. I have 4 things that I believe we miss out on when we choose to stay closed off rather than using our power to be vulnerable. This may not be an all-inclusive list, but these 4 things are very important to me in my life, and I hope that if you have more to add to the list, you will share them in the comments so that we can all learn and grow from each other. The first is that vulnerability inspires compassion. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, it makes room in our hearts for compassion. But this compassion isn't just for others, it's also for ourselves. There's a verse in the Bible that speaks about the bowels of compassion being closed up. In our physical bodies, when we are constipated, we have to eat more fiber, drink more water, or maybe take a gentle laxative. Think of vulnerability as that fiber, that water, or that gentle laxative that opens us up to giving and receiving compassion as God intended. Vulnerability inspires compassion. The second is vulnerability inspires genuine connection. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we permit ourselves to genuinely connect with God and with others. One of my favorite characters in the Bible is Paul. And I find that I connect with Paul because he was so open and so vulnerable. In his second letter to the church at Corinth, he said, "My friends at Corinth, our hearts are wide open to you and we speak freely, holding nothing back from you. If there is a block in our relationship, it is not with us. For we carry you in our hearts with great love, yet you still withhold your affection from us. So I speak to you as our children. Make room in your hearts for us as we have done for you." In this preamble to this letter, Paul was challenging the people at the church of Corinth. And he was challenging them to be more vulnerable and to open their hearts to him and the other apostles. And this is my challenge to you today. Before I continue, I want to pause here and say that there is a difference between honesty and vulnerability. Honesty is about telling the truth. Vulnerability is about revealing the deeper layers of who you are. We are called to be honest with everybody, but we must restrict vulnerability to our close circle. Jesus did this and modeled to us how to layer our vulnerability based on the closeness of the relationships that we have. And if anyone is supposed to be our example, he should be our example. Jesus didn't show himself on the Mount of Configuration to all the people who are following him. He also didn't show himself in that moment to all his 12 disciples. He took with him the 3 that were very, very close to him, his inner circle. And yes, there were certain things that he shared with the crowds. There were certain vulnerable sides of him that he shared with his followers. There were certain vulnerable sides to him that his followers didn't see, that his disciples got to see. But then there were certain parts of himself that he saved just for those 3 that were in his innermost circle. He layered his vulnerability. And that's what I'm encouraging you guys to do today. I'm not saying vulnerably blurt out all your deep, dark secrets to everybody and anybody. No. Like, know the people in your circle, know the different relationships that you have, and the level at which you have reached in those relationships. And that level will tell you how far you can go and how vulnerable that you can be with certain people. Vulnerability inspires connection, genuine connection. The third is that vulnerability feeds love. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we cultivate love in our relationships. Vulnerability feeds real love, the kind of love that is unconditional and doesn't expect anything in return. When we are vulnerable, we allow our loved ones to love every part of us, even the parts that we think are unlovable. When we are vulnerable, we allow God to show us His unconditional love through the people in our lives. As we receive that love, it helps us to settle more into who we are in Christ, and this helps our faith in God to grow. Vulnerability feeds love. Last but not least, vulnerability feeds healing. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we make room in our hearts for healing. Think of a wound that needs to be cleaned before it can begin to heal. Vulnerability provides that cleaning process, and it exposes our hearts to engage directly with God's healing hand. Back to James 5 verse 16. We can't experience wholeness and healing as God intended if we are not vulnerable. And yes, I'm saying be vulnerable with God, but as human beings, we're not designed to just have a vertical relationship, just us and God. Yes, that vertical relationship is important, and it's one that we need to cultivate, and it's one where we need to be vulnerable as well. But God knows everything about us anyways. Us going to Him and being vulnerable allows us to say those things about ourselves that we're scared to say out loud in His presence, and acknowledge to ourselves that as much as I've said this thing that might be, God still loves me. But we are challenged in James 5 verse 16 to be vulnerable in our vertical relationships, our human-to-human relationships. We can't just tell our deep, dark secrets to God. We need to have people in our lives who we can trust, keyword, trust, with our deep, dark secrets. When we share those things, then we make room for healing. When we share those things, we begin that process of exposing our hearts to God's healing hand. It's not the person that heals us when we share those things to us, but I don't know how God designed it. The minute we just talk to somebody, even when it comes to sin, God has designed it in such a way that when we are open to somebody, just one other human being, we tell that person of a sin that we're struggling with, all of a sudden that sin loses its power. It's a miracle from God. It's the same way that it happens when we need healing in our hearts, from our past, from past trauma, from like what I shared about, not having my dad in my life. That was a trauma. That was a painful experience to have gone through as a young child that I masked with lies. And lying is wrong. I couldn't go on lying for forever. And when my friend called that out, I had to actually be honest with myself and be like, wow, I now remember all the lies that I was telling back then, and yeah, as a kid, that seemed like the easiest thing to do. But as a grown woman, I now have to face that 8-year-old and make room for her vulnerability. Our vulnerability allows us to begin to heal. But the other thing that happens, and this is why vulnerability is a superpower, is because our vulnerability also makes room for other people to heal. All of a sudden, when they hear us being vulnerable, when they hear us sharing our deep, dark secrets, when they hear us boldly professing that this was my past, this is what I went through, this is what I did, but God, all of a sudden they are also brave enough to share their vulnerabilities. All of a sudden they're also brave enough to trust that if they can be open and honest, God can accept them just the way they are. Vulnerability feeds healing. Vulnerability is our superpower. It's not a dirty word. It's not a bad word. It's not a bad thing. Vulnerability actually is a superpower, and we're not supposed to underestimate it. So don't underestimate it. You need to recognize that vulnerability is not for the faint-hearted. It's not for the weak, because it actually requires an enormous amount of courage for you to step out and to be vulnerable. So let God stir up compassion and connection in your heart as you allow yourself to be fully seen by the people in your circle. And as you practice using this newfound superpower, let it create the perfect conditions for love to grow and healing to take place. I hope this video has encouraged you. If it has, let us know about it in the comments. Let us know your thoughts on what other things vulnerability hinders us from experiencing, and share this video with a friend. Heroes and heroines have superpowers so that they can fight. And the chance to fight is a privilege, and you guys are definitely worth that fight.